Picard season one had a decently unforgettable finale in that last 15 minutes of that final episode of the season. Definitely one that I didn't see coming the first time I saw it back in 2020 when it first came out. And then naturally, as tends to happen with creative and intriguing artistic content, it continues to invite thought and exploration as I rewatched the episode 4 years later here in 2024. Which is kind of why, when I was preparing my video to talk about some highlights from rewatching that final episode last week, I very quickly came to realize there's no way I can cram this into one video. That tiny little 15-minute segment at the end of the episode invites so much reflection and exploration. It's got to be its own video. So that's this video. This is basically just me walking through my notes that I barfed up onto the page after my last rewatch. So basically a combination of my musings about how to interpret the particular scene with data, as well as some musings about how this kind of cross-references with similar themes and concepts throughout Star Trek, which things just kept coming to my mind and they just barfed out on that page. And I'm like, dude, there's too much here. And then also some personal reflections on what this reminds me of from my other fields of interest and stuff like that. So first off, a quick summary of the episode, pardon me, quick summary of the 15-minute sequence here. This is the sequence where Picard, after doing all his heroic acts in the earlier parts of the episode, he kind of passes out on the La Serena with a high probability of being at death's final door. And then Picard wakes up in front of a fireplace with Commander Data, who does look a little funny compared to when we last saw him in Nemesis. But it is still, it's pretty impressive that they were able to show us a non-elderly Commander Data at all. Anyway, they talk, they exchange a lot of really meaningful and compelling dialogue, and then the white light comes and Picard has to go. But Data makes his last request, that he be allowed to achieve mortality and thus finally become existentially human by coming to the end of his existence. So Picard pulls the plug, one little colorful Star Trek chip at a time, and Data fades away on the couch. Meanwhile, Picard has been given a new body, which is exactly like his old one, without any superpowers. And as Picard says, "You didn't make me immortal, did you?" No, they didn't. And they made sure his body would continue to age the same way it would have. And that's pretty much it. That's, they're really a nice little beautiful finale to the season. It feels really good for Picard and Data to get that final little exchange there where they sit and talk about stuff. And it's also kind of nice to think that Picard doesn't have to die after all, or not quite yet, at least. So that's the summary. Now let me just kind of run through my jot notes that I threw down. First off, I ended up listing 4 possible interpretations of the whole Data dying, when he kind of ages quickly. They animate him to like he's aging, that whole sequence there where he dies. So 4 different interpretations, which I'll just list here and then I'll end up talking about later on in the video. Number 1, I had, this is my initial kind of instinctive interpretation, is that this is primarily a commentary on the topic of afterlife. And number 2, I was thinking, well, maybe it is primarily a commentary on the topic of the scientific pursuit of conditional mortality. Number 3, I was thinking maybe it's primarily a commentary on the topic of medically assisted suicide. And number 4, maybe it's primarily a commentary on the topic of suicide. And then I added, as I was thinking, I added number 5, which is not interpretation per se, but it's more of an aspect. I wrote down maybe it relates to the concept of living, living that's not really living, or, being alive, but not really living, that kind of thing. And then I jotted down 6, just kind of on a completely subjective level. Some aspects of the portrayal drew my attention to the relationship between rest and Sheol in ancient Hebrew thought, and how that relates to that concept, just kind of me thinking about how that relates to the various 5 different things I listed above, in combination as well with the psychological idea that inactivity can sometimes be the polar opposite of rest. One of the things that makes them interesting, as I was kind of thinking about them after I wrote them down, part of what makes them so interesting is that whichever one of numbers 1 through 4, whichever one you think is actually in view, and I think even number 5 is probably, it's there. Maybe they weren't thinking about it as much, but anyway, whichever one you think is in view, the concepts are so interconnected. These themes and the ideas are so interconnected and related that in some way, whichever one was actually in mind, it's still going to be fascinating to think about each one of them in light of the imagery that we got to see there. Now, what I want to do next, this video is a little more disorganized than some of my videos, but I just kind of threw down a bunch of cross references at this point for those various interpretations. So basically, for the themes that are implied in those interpretations, here are some cross references throughout Star Trek, some different Star Trek stories that popped in my head as I was writing down those 4 interpretations. So for interpretations 1 and 2, the idea of afterlife and the idea of scientifically finding a way to cause us to live possibly forever, those 2 categories. For that one, we're kind of repeating some of the themes that were presented in Generations. Though last time I rewatched Generations, I did realize you can actually watch the whole film from a pro-afterlife perspective, and it remains a coherent film. And I wonder if that was done intentionally, because normally I've seen Generations as being kind of chipping away at the idea of an afterlife as something that's positive. Last time I watched it, I started to think maybe it's not. Maybe it's more what I listed as category 2. Then for category 3, on the topic of assisted suicide, got a number of interesting things here that we've seen. So we might think of the DS9 season 4 episode, The Quickening, in which Bashir tries to cure an alien race from a deadly artificial disease engineered by the Dominion. And then Bashir meets their own doctor, Trevian, and he finds that this doctor's way of handling things is to medically administer a wonderful little poison to speed up their death. Bashir and Trevian come to blows about this practice, but then once Bashir finally actually finds a cure, Trevian ends up backing Bashir and doing everything he can to go and spread that cure as fast as possible. Or you might think about the Voyager episode Critical Care, in which these aliens who kidnap the doctor to get his medical help, they're all busy about using just absolutely egregious medical expenses to keep these privileged few people alive while allowing less privileged people to suffer and die. Or you might think of the brief scene in Star Trek V, the movie, in which McCoy experiences this haunting memory of when his dad was on the medical table and he ended up pulling the plug on his suffering father, only to find shortly later that there actually was a cure that could have been used to save him. I think even more relevant to the topic would be the Voyager episode Death Wish, in which the immortal Q named Quinn wanted to end the monotony of Q existence by killing himself, but the continuum wouldn't allow it. So the topic of living forever, and then really fitting, I think, are the 2 Klingon assisted suicide stories. There's one in The Next Generation and one in Deep Space Nine, which I think is really fascinating to kind of put them side by side, how they're similar and how they're different. In the Next Generation episode, Worf had been paralyzed, probably for life, they thought. So he asked Riker to kill him as part of a Klingon ritual that would allow him to retain his honor, have an honorable death, killed ritually by his friend. And Riker was absolutely repulsed. And there was at one point in the episode where he arrogantly criticized Worf for his selfishness, if I remember it right. But then Picard meets up with Riker and encourages Riker to be more understanding and to realize the significance of this being a cultural difference and that kind of thing. And then in the DS9 episode, where Worf tries to kill his brother Kurn as part of the same ritual, Sisko basically calls him into his office and gives him a vicious scolding, insisting, he should have known better. This kind of behavior is unacceptable for a Starfleet officer. So as I was kind of musing on these 2 similar stories and how they fit in with the theme here, I started thinking about how it seems like we have 3 different perspectives about the moral nature, how the characters see the morality of this Klingon suicide ritual. We had Riker's perspective, Picard's perspective, and Sisko's perspective, which were all quite different. But then it occurred to me that, maybe that's not really the case at all. We don't have 3 perspectives. Maybe instead, you're really seeing 3 different situations. Because Riker's situation was that he was asked to kill his friend with a horrid-looking, jagged ritual knife. His friend, who's laying in the hospital and has a young son and a lot of people who look up to him. Whereas Picard's situation was that he's watching one of his officers treating another officer in a condescending, judgmental, and disgusted attitude. And then Sisko's situation was that he just had one of his most trusted officers get caught trying to murder his own brother on board the space station, which he's in command of. He's trying to manage, and so probably, certainly probably some of these characters do have some slight variations in terms of their subjective feelings or their way of viewing the concept of Klingon ritual suicide, how to respond to it. But probably the biggest difference in their reactions is actually just the fact that they're each reacting to quite different interpersonal situations. But anyway, one thing that's kind of interesting in light of Star Trek Picard is that the one who was the most open to Klingon ritual suicide was Picard. And in this situation that we're at now, Picard seems kind of unhesitant to do a very similar act toward Data, which incidentally is a bit odd considering his attitude toward keeping villains alive, but whatever we think about that. And then just on the topic of number 5, living as living and living as dying, it definitely takes me back to the beginning of Picard's story in the early episodes of the season, which I've talked about a number of times in this series of videos, and I'll make a reference to it again near the end of this video. So anyway, those are just some interesting cross references on the themes that come up when you think about how to interpret that scene with Data. So now let me just kind of go back and talk about some of my first reactions to the beginning of this scene. My first thought on my first watch back in 2020, just as it began, when Picard wakes up in that kind of living room area with Data, my first reaction was just to interpret this as a NDE or an afterlife type experience. And I kind of tend to imagine that this was the intended reaction and one that a lot of people probably automatically had for those first couple of minutes. Now, we've seen NDEs and afterlife type scenes in Star Trek in various ways. At least they've been alluded to. They've certainly been visualized, or we've seen them happen, and we've seen them talked about. But it was never, none of those were actually supposed to have happened in universe, with the exception of Sisko. When Sisko went to be with the prophets at the end of DS9, that happened. But other than that, all the NDE-like experiences didn't tend to be ones that were actually, they happened and they were actually an afterlife that a character actually went to. And some of them, to list some of them, were the TNG episode Tapestry, was where Q pretends to be God, and Picard says, "You're not God. The universe is not so badly designed," So you could say it was an afterlife, but really it was just Q doing his Q things that he does, And we had the DS9 episode where Quark has a dream that he wakes up in the Divine Treasury and he gets spoken to by the great Ferengi icon Gint, who looks suspiciously like Rom. And when he asks him why he looks like Rom, he says, I think this is the part where he says, "Because you're dreaming, you idiot," or something like that. That was a pretty cool scene. I like that scene. There was the Voyager episode. There were a number of them in Voyager. There was a Voyager episode where Janeway has an NDE. She's on the planet, and Chakotay's, "Come on, Janeway." This is the one where there's actually an alien masquerading as Janeway's father, trying to lure her into the white light, basically so that he can feed on her disembodied soul for all eternity, or at least for a long time, however long it takes to sustain him and drain her out of it, whatever. And then what was interesting about this one was they kind of ponder near the end of the episode, I wonder if this is just what happens when a lot of people come near death and there are aliens like him kind of lurking like spiders, waiting for people, Then we had the season 7 Voyager episode where B'Elanna thinks that she has arrived at the barge of the dead. And for a lot of the episode, the watcher is allowed to think that that's what happened as well. But by the end, it seems like it's probably a dream, or at least, at most, some kind of spiritual vision related to a near-death experience. So Star Trek has had NDEs, and it has had afterlives, the afterlife, an afterlife of some kind on the table for discussion. But usually it hasn't, Star Trek hasn't included real ones that were actually supposed to, that's what they are, with the exception of Sisko at the end of DS9 when he went to be with the prophets. So if this was an actual afterlife in which Picard reunites with Data, that would have been a little unusual. Now, I thought it was interesting, though, that Picard isn't particularly surprised to wake up and see Data within this afterlife flavor kind of context. He doesn't seem surprised by that, but he does seem kind of surprised when Data tells him it's a simulation. It's almost like, for all the Starfleet skepticism that characterizes Picard's life, it's almost like there's still some kind of intuition that causes him to not end up feeling surprised that he would experience something after death. And it seems that this particular kind of scene here is the kind of thing that he had been either hoping for, or for some reason he's just not really surprised. I mean, so much so that he wonders if it could be a dream, because he's dreamed about this kind of thing happening. It's interesting that the dream category comes up again, because when I recently rewatched Barge of the Dead from Voyager, I noticed that their main way of painting B'Elanna's NDE was, at the end of the day, it became very dreamlike. And the interpretation that I come away with is that it really would have been some kind of dream, or at most a vision. It's interesting. There's this book I've been reading through about NDEs. It's called Evidence of the Afterlife by Jeffrey Long and Perry Paul. And as they're talking about what their survey-based studies show about commonalities and differences in NDE reports, and what they consider to be credible NDE reports, one thing they say in chapter 3 is they say one of their surveys, it was a survey of 613 respondents, and they'd included the question, was the experience dreamlike in any way? And then I'm just going to read a section out of the book. It says that was the question, and it says they allowed only a narrative answer. So there would have been a box, they had to fill in or something like that. And they say the response to the question was generally an adamant no. So they don't give us a number. In most of the book, they'll give you a percent number for each of the answers. They don't give a number. They just say it was generally an adamant no. And then they say, this finding is especially significant given that the wording of the question encouraged a positive response if any part of the NDE was dreamlike. End quote. And then later on, the authors quote Grayson and Kelly. No idea who they are, some researchers, I guess, but the authors quote them as saying that in an analysis of 520 cases, quote, 80% of the experiencers described their thinking during the NDEs as clearer than usual or as clear as usual, suggesting a kind of lucidity that wouldn't make as much sense if the NDE is just a dream state from a dying brain. So anyway, just a little aside about some of that, since it's something that stood out to me and kind of relates to the discussion a little bit. And sometimes I like to tie in things that I'm reading, in non-fiction related stuff when they pop out to me. And definitely when you hear NDE stories, which I'm not that into the area there, but I've read enough stories to get the impression sometimes they do sound dreamlike, particularly when you read them and you bump into elements that are just kind of weird, such as one that I read a little bit ago where the experiencer, I think it was in the same book it was the same book that I just mentioned, but there was an NDE they listed where the guy said, he was having tea or coffee with his grandmother, and in the cup of tea or coffee, whatever it was, there was steam coming out of it, but it was lukewarm. So when you read that, and the only framework that I have is that sounds dreamlike to me, because if I saw, steam coming out of something and then I drank it and it was lukewarm, I would have to be in a dream, But apparently, at least for those 613 people, even though it had elements like that in it, it didn't seem dreamlike anyway. So it's kind of interesting to think about. But for Picard here, in this particular case, it's not a dream, nor is it a near-death experience. And the only reason Picard, because he did comment about could this be a dream, and the main reason he wondered if it was because he's had plenty of dreams of a similar nature, and certainly dreams do sometimes feel real. I definitely had dreams that felt very real, so I can relate to that very much. But now we get to a completely different topic as I transition topics here, because we come to the question of, what's happening literally when Data explains how he happens to be there in that room, because he says they reconstructed his mind and memories from a single neuron, and then they reconstructed his consciousness as well. However in the heck you do that? And they did all this based on what was downloaded into B4. So Data can't remember his death. Now, for myself, when I watched this for the first time, I did what I think you're probably supposed to do, which is just kind of enjoy the moment by suspending your disbelief and watching this as a beautiful little reunion between Picard and Data, kind of like a technology-assisted afterlife. It's this moment that Picard has always longed for, and here it is. Star Trek has a habit of doing interesting things in their stories using pleasantly phony or absurd scientific or philosophical explanations, such as, one of my favorite stories from Voyager was when B'Elanna was split into Klingon B'Elanna and human B'Elanna using some kind of cloning-ish kind of technology. And to enjoy that episode, you really, will do best to completely ignore the literal side and completely suspend your disbelief and watch it as what I think it's supposed to be, which is a heavily symbolic opportunity for B'Elanna to meet herself, to meet the parts within herself that are always at war inside her. And now suddenly she gets to talk to one of them, or they get to talk with each other as walking, talking, separate people walking around. So kind of in the same way, my instinct with a scene like this is to just kind of ignore the literal side and recognize that the creators did a really beautiful job giving us a warm, really relational, really warm little final moment with Picard and Data after everything is over, giving us a little ad hoc in-universe explanation for it. Oh yeah, here's how we did it. We rejiggled the jigglers, and because that's just what we do in Star Trek. We come up with something because that's what we're supposed to do. Oh yeah, B'Elanna got cloned, and the memories came with her. But really, this is just two sides of B'Elanna. But that said, the ad hoc explanation that they give does fit into the pattern of how things tend to work in Star Trek. It also relates to what's going to come up because Picard gets a new artificial body in kind of a similar way, not exactly the same, but kind of similar. You could suggest the problem of the particularized nature of consciousness has always been a bit of an issue for certain Star Trek plot elements. And I guess you could say it's related to the problem of the persistence of the self over time. I don't think that's the correct technical term, but there's a term something like that in some area of philosophy. Basically, the argument goes, if my body and brain are changing, are always changing, let's say that all the cells in your body are destroyed and replaced, let's say every year or something. And I think that's an urban myth. I don't think it's actually true, but it's something you hear. But let's just grant it for the sake of argument. Let's say all my cells in my body are replaced ever so often, one at a time. And certainly physiologically you are changing. So how could I say that I'm the same person as me when I was, in 2020, when I watched this the first time? All the elements, or at least many of the elements of my physiological self have changed. So my identity must not be in these specific atoms and cells and neurons that continue over time. But the case still remains that I am me and you are not me. And my consciousness applies to me, but not to you. And if you were my twin, like Shinzon for Picard, I would still only be me. And if my twin shared some memories with me, like Thomas Riker did with Riker, I would still only be me. And it would be a pretty cruel joke if you just copied all my memories out and then decided to kill me, since my memories are the only things that count. Wouldn't be much different if you copied my memories out and then you put them into a chat bot first and then you killed me. I would still insist you not kill me. I would say that chat bot is not me. Who do you think you're fooling? So while there's definitely a complicated philosophical problem involved in this area, I just give that kind of little snarky little argument just to make the case, whatever you think about whether or not we ought to try inventing Star Trek transporters, my argument is kind of that, at least in this particular case with Data, it seems to kind of defeat itself, because this new synthesized version of Data, this one that Picard met inside the computer chip, this version of Data could have been created while the other Data was still alive. And more importantly, Soong and Maddox could have made 3 or 4 of them, or 10. There could be a whole army of them. And then the real Data could still be alive to walk up and say hello, talk to them, get their opinions on things, So needless to say, Data's consciousness, or his personhood as the individual from Insurrection and or Nemesis, that guy's not here in this story. He's not in this scene, if we interpret the scene literally, as opposed to kind of a symbolic. This is just an artistic way of them getting these guys together. If you interpret it that way, well, certainly it's supposed to be Data. But if you interpret it literally, this is not the same guy, because this is a separate person who just happens to have the same memories. It's kind of like a clone that had a memory dump loaded in. Kind of reminds me of we had some discussions about the ethics of cloning we had the DS9 season 1 episode, A Man Alone, where there was a criminal who grew an adult clone of himself. He grew it in his quarters in this bubbling liquid so that he could murder the clone. And then he could disappear, and have everyone think he was dead. And then once he was caught, he was considered guilty of murder, because it wasn't himself he killed, that's for sure. And then there was the situation in Enterprise season 3, the episode called Similitude, in which they found this, they had this illegal substance they could use to grow a quick grow clone of Tucker. And I guess he needed some, I forget if he needed organs or what, but they grew this clone. Or I know what it was. They needed him to repair some parts of the ship or something. I don't remember. I just remember the important part is they grew the clone knowing that because of the way this illegal substance works, the clone's going to die within several weeks or something like that. And then if I remember right, he then begged for them to find a way to keep him alive or something like that. But it was quite a emotionally difficult kind of scenario for the characters. But one thing that wouldn't have happened would have been for them to wake up the real Tucker and tell him, okay, hey, it's okay if you want to go ahead and die now because we got your clone. Let's say if the clone was not going to die in 2 weeks. But that's something they wouldn't have done, is just wake up and tell him, hey, let's kill you now. You ready to die? Because we got the replacement. I mean, that'd be horrible. It reminds me of the scene from the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. There was this part where the psychologist, played by Leonard Nimoy, Dr. Kibner, he's actually the alien duplicate who had replaced Dr. Kibner, and he's trying to convince the protagonists to let themselves be caught. He tells them that the moment they fall asleep, because what happens in that movie is you fall asleep and that's when the changeover happens and you get replaced. He says the moment they fall asleep, they'll find themselves on a new plane of consciousness where they're free from their emotions because all the fake duplicates, the body snatchers, are these emotionless people. So, when you fall asleep and then you'll find yourself on this new plane, you're free of your emotions. You'll become transformed and awakened, and you have this joy and peace like you never imagined. And that's what happens, It was something like that. I haven't seen it for a while, so it's just based on my memory. But the point is that he was trying to convince them and saying it very eloquently and very convincingly, telling them that being replaced by duplicates, when their old bodies were gone, their consciousness would go on in the duplicates. He was trying to convince them that these pretenders who were stealing their identities actually weren't intruders, because your consciousness goes on within your replacement, as your replacement. And he said it so convincingly that for a minute I almost considered that, maybe this is within the universe, within the story, maybe this is a thing. I almost began to believe that this beautiful, beautiful story he was telling, that things aren't scary at all. I almost started, and then very quickly you realize, of course, it's an evil lie. The protagonists don't seem to even consider it. I was like, aren't they considering it? And they didn't even for a moment. It's kind of like, man, you can't tell me that this fake pretender pretending to be me and then killing me after, you can't tell me that's actually me. You just killed me. This thing isn't even human. How can it be me when it's not even human? So anyway, I'm getting a little afield here talking about body snatchers, but all that to say, I think to enjoy this scene, the way to do it is to suspend your disbelief and recognize that this is supposed to be Picard's reunion with Data, with kind of an afterlife kind of flavor mixed in. Don't get too caught up on the idea of the particularity of an individual and the nature of consciousness in that sense. And certainly for Star Trek, the idea of getting past death by downloading your brain somewhere else in kind of a data transfer kind of way. Pardon my pun, Data transferred himself by data transfer, by transferring data. Wow, there's just no other way to phrase that. But anyway, that kind of thing is definitely something of a common theme. The ones that pop in my head first are the Next Generation Season 2 episode where Ira Graves downloads himself into Data in the episode The Schizoid Man. And then the other one that pops in my head is the DS9 episode where Rayo Vantica downloaded himself into various people using a tiny little computer chip. That's the episode name is The Passenger. And there's tons of other episodes with a similar idea. And some of them are done in kind of a more of a metaphysical kind of way where it's almost like the consciousness itself is this kind of spirit-like thing that moves and goes into someone. And those kinds are just like everywhere in Star Trek. But then there's also ones where it's much more like the information in your brain is just computer information. And if we download that somewhere else, then you go somewhere else. And you don't think about the fact that downloading information means that you make a copy and then delete the old stuff. We don't tend to think about that part. But anyway, this is just something where we suspend our disbelief, and that's a way to just to kind of enjoy it and recognize that this is it's a fantasy story. That's what we do with it. But as the scene goes on, we also talk about some more serious topics, and so after we find out that this is a simulation and everything, then after that, it's kind of like a whole bunch of topics, really deep topics, are thrown at us all at once. So first, Data makes some comments about the nature of life. The idea that in order to be fully human, Data needs to be immortal, or sorry, pardon me, Data needs to be mortal, which means he needs to ultimately die. A butterfly that lives forever isn't a butterfly at all. I mean, it kind of sounds like some echoes of Generations, like I said earlier. If you remember in Generations, where Picard said emphatically to Soren that we are defined by our mortality. I'm pretty sure that's a quote, though I haven't rewatched it since I wrote that down. But anyway, so definitely a very familiar concept. But here, Data requests that when Picard leaves, Picard permanently end the program so that Data will cease to exist. And Picard, without hesitation, agrees. So this is when we get to the four different interpretations that I listed out above. So as Picard is pulling out those chips one after another over the music of Blue Skies, really representing another decision Data has made. Not the decision we saw back in Nemesis, which we associate with Blue Skies, with that song. Not that decision, when he catapulted himself across space to give his life to save Picard's. This is not that decision, but another similar decision in which he gave up his life. And this is the part where we kind of, or at least I do, kind of raise an eyebrow and ask ourselves what on earth the writers are actually trying to say, because this is a really impactful, powerful scene, and there's a lot of interesting ideas built in here, and there's different ways you can take it. And certainly this is not how we expected the story to go, at least not how I expected it to go. So it sticks in your head for that reason, for sure. It's very kind of creative and out of the mold of what we expected to see. And I would suggest that for each of the various interpretations, we'll come away with something just a little bit different in terms of what we come away from it with. So first, the one that occurred to me first as I watched it the first time was the Afterlife interpretation, since Afterlife is clearly a significant part of the symbolic flavor of the scene in terms of Picard and Data having their beautiful, meeting after death and with white lights and everything like that. So by this way of looking at it, when Data is saying that the butterfly that lives forever is not a butterfly, Data must die to be human, you could say, is Data to be interpreted as somebody speaking from within the afterlife saying, I must cease to exist in order to be a real person. So I guess from this one, it would kind of be Star Trek creators taking a jab at religious belief, saying, if there is an afterlife, man, we don't want that kind of thing. And this was actually my initial interpretation. And for myself, as somebody who does believe strongly that there's a significance to the human self continuing after death. So for myself, I found the scene quite a little bit disappointing, interpreting it that way on my first watch. Disappointing, but not surprising at all, because I'm kind of interpreting it in light of the kind of anti-religion kind of stuff we get in the original series and the Next Generation. And really, as far as the intensity of it, it's quite a lightweight, expression. If they are saying, hey, there is an afterlife, I don't want it. That's a fairly lightweight kind of thing to say versus the more emphatically anti-religious messages we got in the originals and the Next Generation. But anyway, so that was my first interpretation. And then in my list that I gave at the beginning of this video, that was number one there. But since my first watch, particularly in the last year or so, I've begun to consider some of these other interpretations that I listed. And I don't anymore. I mean, usually a lot of the time I end up just kind of standing on my initial intuitive interpretation and say, no, that's got to be what it means. But I don't think it's necessarily a given which one of these four was necessarily actually meant for us to come away with. So the second one I listed is to interpret it as a commentary on the possibility of human engineered conditional mortality. So in other words, a commentary on the field of research or the field of inquiry toward trying to find ways to stop or reverse the aging process so that people can, or at least certain people would be able to live indefinitely. So I was recently listening to a podcast where they interviewed Stephen Cave, one of the contributors to the book, Should You Choose to Live Forever? And this is pretty much at least primarily the discussion on the table there. Question of, would it really be beneficial for us if we can manage to push this enough until we finally break through and find ways to deal with the aging process so that basically what we'd end up with is having life as we know it, the way life is for humans, and just keep it going indefinitely, possibly forever if someone doesn't have a tragic accident and die. And the question is, what would that do to the nature of motivation, the nature of our ability to existentially appreciate the individual moments that we have, to appreciate the loved ones around us, the value of life itself. And in a way, this discussion would kind of fit in with the existential themes presented throughout season 1. The idea that since life is short, since death is coming, live in light of the coming of your death. So Picard, go find Elnor. Raffi, go talk to your son. Get to know your grandson before he grows up and ends up passing away. Life is short, don't waste it. Every moment of life is like the beating of a tender, fragile butterfly wing. Here today, gone tomorrow, like the petals of a flower in fall time. And if we could suddenly find some way to upset that balance, would that really be something we really want to do? It reminds me of the comment from one of the characters in The Lord of the Rings, a character who made the comment that cheating death for long ages, I think it was through the ring, I forget what part of the book this was, but I just remember the comment that using magic to live forever was kind of like being not enough butter spread over too much bread. And I thought that's pretty cool. So from this interpretation, it would be that Data kind of realizes that he's not human yet because he still can't live life existentially. He can't live in the knowledge of the certainty of his death. And so he chooses to gain a few moments of living with the knowledge of the certainty of death, rather than continuing to cheat reality by living with the chalice of the fountain of youth in his hands. But what we actually see isn't Picard making Data mortal. But what we see is Picard actually ending Data's life, which is when we might begin to consider options 3 and 4. The idea is this possibly really in some way talking about, or at least overlapping with, the question of suicide or medically assisted suicide. Now, if you remember that Voyager episode, which I mentioned earlier, Death Wish from season 2 of Voyager, if you remember, Quinn, the Q who wanted to die, he was finally granted mortality by the Continuum as a reasonable alternative to his death wish. We can give you that. That's not so bad. But then shortly after beginning his new life as a mortal on board Voyager, he went and ingested a poison and killed himself the old-fashioned way. Because immortality per se wasn't really his complaint. He just wanted to die. And then in this situation, Picard doesn't make Data mortal or give him a lifespan or anything like that. He kills him. Data already ends his life, he wipes him out. Data may have used existential and philosophical ideas to bolster his request for suicide, but the fact is that he didn't ask for mortality in the sense of being able to live with the knowledge of the certainty of death. He asked for death with just a very few moments of dressing up in black and laying on the couch before passing away. And I have to admit, watching it this time around versus, the last couple times I watched it, this time watching it, the image was too close to other images of suicide for me to feel comfortable as I watched it. Whereas before I wasn't even, thinking about that. I mean, but really all you have to do is put a pill bottle in his hand. Now, I definitely don't think the creators were trying to make a comment on suicide in that kind of way when they put it together. I think we can definitely give them the benefit of the doubt on that aspect, and especially the way they animated Data's face as going through the aging process. I think that's suggesting that his death is supposed to represent a normal process of death, just accelerated, symbolically. This is Data being a young person growing old and dying, at a ripe old age. But when you combine together elements like he's dressed in black, so it's kind of like he dressed himself up in black, and it's almost like he's going through these ritual-like steps of getting ready to die, and then ultimately laying out on the couch and slipping away. I have to say this scene becomes a little more disturbing the more I think about it, because of other similar things that have happened in real life. I would suggest that this isn't the kind of image that creatives should be trying to create if possible. And my perspective on that is partly very much particularly shaped by relatively recently finding out about things like, one thing is finding out, that there are online communities that glorify suicide and help young people find ways to go through with it. And particularly, I'm thinking of watching a YouTube documentary a while back that discussed a web forum that led to the death of particularly a family member of the person who ended up making the video. And then he ended up kind of going on a, investigation, and then to try to kind of expose and shut down what's going on, because that particular forum led to countless deaths, and it was currently being pursued to be removed. But in their About tab, they go and list philosophical categories that are, the basis of what they believe. And then you finally get, I think it was the last one you finally get to, and they call it pro-mortalism. The belief that, and I'm just paraphrasing all of this from my memory, but basically the belief that death isn't a bad thing, but it's a good thing. And then of course they listed all the other more familiar philosophical categories that are much more common, such as probably I remember one of them was the primacy of free choice, like that's paramount to them. And I'm sure they had materialism, the materialistic nature of the universe, and I'm pretty sure nihilism was one of them, the idea that there's really not meaning to be found anywhere. But anyway, so all these ideas that came together, and pro-mortalism is their main idea. And basically what you wouldn't find it necessarily on the surface. Like on the surface, it looks like just a forum where people can be free to talk about suicide, but you spend enough time actually watching what the moderators are pushing, in actual, discussion, is that they're not just encouraging open talk about suicide, but even moving toward the process of literally giving people the means to kill themselves, and telling them, every step along the way, telling them, don't open up to your parents, don't open up to mental health professionals, don't tell anyone, because they will just tell you not to go through with it. And there's this whole thing where suicide, like every one of us, when we're in that kind of space, we can romanticize suicide and see it as a beautiful thing. But then, you come to realize there are a lot of people out there who actually want to glorify suicide. So anyway, with some of that in my head, that kind of changes the way I watch a scene like this. So when I see someone laying out in this calm, reverent way to prepare for his arranged death, I kind of see it a little differently, because now I realize there are active people who do see suicide as something to glorify, something beautiful to dress up and prepare for. But it's not beautiful when someone prepares for a ritual death and then feels that first twinge, and then peacefully settles down to become free. That's not beautiful at all. So anyway, I think the interpretation of saying this is about suicide, I think it's something we can cross off in the sense of being something that the writers were intending to say. But I think it's definitely something we should be aware of, just being aware that it's very much on the table for a lot of young people who feel that they have to end their life. And some of these people are also being told by other people that it is something beautiful. and nothing else is going to set them free from the affliction of existing, except for that beautiful gift of being allowed to end your life with all the, forethought and plan of all the stuff that you do to make your death perfect, And that brings me to my fifth point here, which is not a separate interpretation from the above, but it's just kind of an observation. It's an aspect, which I think is there. And this is just kind of the setup relating to the idea of going on living when you're not really living. So thinking back to Picard's opening situation on the vineyard when he's experiencing, as Laris puts it, melancholy. And then he later finally realizes, I haven't been living, I've been waiting to die. That idea of being alive, technically, biologically, but not really living. And then mixing that as well with Elnor's comments at the beginning of this episode, his comments about the XBs in part one of this two-part, when he said they don't have a home or a really strong identity, everybody hates them. So wouldn't it be better to just not be alive anymore? Because isn't that what makes us what we are? Isn't that what life is, and personhood and individuality and the meaning of life? Isn't it all kind of wrapped up in all these things which they don't have? I think it's important to realize that we can all find ourselves in places in life when some of the key aspects that make life feel like life, that make us feel alive, make us feel like we are actually persons, make us feel like we are real, and that being alive or having a life is preferable to not being alive or not having a life. We can find ourselves in places where some of these things, or maybe even all of them, are gone. Community, life goals, people who care about us, happiness, the ability to enjoy things you enjoy, doing fun things and feeling joy in it, having a sense of meaning in relation to your identity and your place in relation to the world and in relation to others. All these are the kinds of things that often, or even always, contribute to the feeling we have that we are actually living, as opposed to dying or being dead. And it's possible to go on existing while being so distant from these important things that reflect our humanness and our personhood, that make life subjectively meaningful. We can be so far from them that for some people, we can feel that there isn't any benefit to being alive rather than being dead. There's no meaning, and we would be better off dead. And for Data, in this situation, if we were to look at him as a real person, I think for Data, I would suggest that this did result in his feeling that everything is empty, and death is the only thing that's left to give me some meaning. Because he was just going on day after day after day in a big empty room all by himself with no one and no thing to give life meaning. So if he had an active emotion chip, which I don't think he did at this point, if he did, he would have most likely been experiencing major depression. And even without the emotion chip, I think he was probably still experiencing the emptiness and futility and the dreadful existential boredom of isolation and inactivity. Or to use some more emotional words, the painfully devastating boredom of isolation and inactivity. And that brings me to the last comment I had on my list there. So I had the first four, which were the interpretations, and then I just kept going and I listed the fifth one, which is just kind of there. It's an aspect rather than an interpretation. And then I listed the sixth one, which is just kind of a subjective reference from me, another aspect that's more in reference to just other stuff that's in my head. So when the scene transitioned from Data's dim lit room there to the brighter sunlit open spaces on Coppelius, we had that transition where you get to see Picard with everyone else, and it's all bright and happy. And they're all, hi, Picard, welcome back, And that transition from that little dim lit space to the big open bright space, it just kind of reminded me, just those things that pop in your head, when you watch a movie. And it reminded me of the Hebrew category of Sheol, the shadowy, quiet place that we go when we die, and how that relates to the concept of rest. Even though the ancient Hebrews used the language of going down to Sheol, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, like going down to hell. And in particular, it comes up in the story of the patriarch Eov, who, the story goes, he lost everything in life that an ancient Hebrew would value in life. So it's his possessions, his family, everything. He lost it all in one fell swoop. And then most of the text of the book of Yov is poetry about this holy man trying to grapple with his situation. And in the opening poem, he starts off by just saying two things that he's longing for in this extended Hebrew poetry. The one is that he wishes his birth wouldn't have happened. And he paints all the different poetic angles about how beautiful it would be if the day of his birth could have been scratched out or blotted out, or wouldn't have been allowed to happen. Because within his belief system, that's where non-existence is going to be found. It's found in the past, before your birth. And he's literally aiming his words at God, because he's asking why God didn't stop his birth. Why is God so nasty that he let it happen? And then he moves on to express the other thing, his longings for something a little more current, which is that he could descend into Sheol. He's wishing he could die. And he paints all the different poetic angles about how beautiful that would be and why he longs for it so much. And he doesn't mention or consider suicide, because that would just make his bad situation even worse in certain ways. But he does keep on asking God why God is holding this back from him, why God won't grant his request and take him to the grave. And what's interesting is how Yov refers to Sheol, or death, particularly as the place where he would find rest. Because rest is what he's longing for, to sink down into the earth, where he doesn't have all the pain and hopes and fears and dashed expectations and social obligations and the constant tormenting fears that plague him now. And no regrets either. And so what made all this pop into my head is because Data is kind of in something like a shadowy afterlife resting place underneath Coppelius, as it were. But Data's not finding rest. In fact, he's still longing for rest. I almost wonder if what Data was actually looking for when he asked Picard to make him mortal. I wonder if he was longing for rest from the perpetual whining motor inside his mind, the endless succession of moments that won't leave him alone, the endless tugging demands of keeping on being alive. Because just keeping on existing isn't rest. Just merely finding inactivity and having less work isn't rest. And in Yov's case, having fewer relationships and responsibilities in life certainly didn't provide rest. It provided the opposite. What he was longing for was not to have less to do, but to enter a qualitatively different phase of existence in which all the norms and categories relevant to this chapter of life have all wrapped up and come to their natural end. He was longing to slip into another mold of reality and existential rightness. He was longing for that phase where he's just waiting under the earth without having to make choices or live life or figure out, like in the last phase, where he's struggling against the grain of reality, trying to get back the way life is supposed to be. But instead, being in another place where there is a way life is supposed to be, but he's in that. And so he just kind of waits in a state of rest and peace without any regret or uncertainty or anything else to torment him. Which kind of suggests to us maybe rest isn't actually about inactivity, but maybe rest is just about fitting into the mold that matches what you really are and what reality actually is. Maybe rest isn't about sitting in a comfortable chair by a fireplace or laying out on a couch with nothing on your mind. But maybe rest is about being what you really are supposed to be at the deepest level and finding satisfaction and peace by your integration into that which is greater than you. Maybe it's going with the grain of reality instead of against it. So while Yov may have longed for rest in the grave, and you and I, at times, certainly find ourselves longing for the same thing, but maybe we can find the rest we long for here by beginning to live again, one slow moment at a time, which might start with just getting out of that chair or out of that room and would almost definitely include things like learning to understand the depression you're experiencing, or the grief you're experiencing, or the trauma you're recovering from, or the despair that you're currently experiencing. But that rest can be found, because rest isn't inactivity and it isn't non-existence. And freedom isn't inactivity and freedom isn't non-existence. And then maybe death itself is the most impactful reason to keep living today and to keep on trying to live well. Maybe the certainty of your death is one of the biggest reasons to do what you can to try to find just a little more wholeness today than you did yesterday, even if it is just one faltering step at a time. Because the moments are few and can't be undone.